Asserting freedom of the press, New York Times Company vs. Sullivan case analysis. Introduction. The issue of defamation and freedom of speech has dominated public debates for a long time. The New York Times Company vs. Sullivan case of 1964 was one of the landmark rulings that raised the bar regarding the way defamation cases filed by aggrieved parties against media companies would be resolved. The New York Times had been sued by Montgomery Public Safety Commissioner, Mr. Sullivan, who claimed that an advert published in the newspaper's edition of March 29, 1960, defamed his character. The advert criticized the actions of the Alabama State Police, which had arrested Martin Luther King Jr. on unclear charges. The advert intended to solicit funds to aid the legal defense of King Jr., who had been charged with perjury in a court in Alabama. Sullivan had stated that the way the advert described the police was inaccurate. He argued that this portrayed his leadership negatively because he was in charge of supervising other police officers in the department. He also stated that the newspaper failed to publish a retraction after he had requested its senior editors to do so. However, the paper defended itself, claiming that the language used in the advert did not refer to him as an individual in any way. Therefore, the paper claimed that Sullivan had misinterpreted information in the advert, and thus his claims lacked merit. The case had been administered earlier in the state of Alabama, where Sullivan had been awarded $500,000 as a settlement for the defamation case. Upon appeal, the respondents sought to overturn the ruling made by the court in Alabama because it interfered with the First Amendment, which protects freedom of speech. Major case issues. Freedom of expression was one of the major issues the case sought to address. There have been many defamation cases brought against the media by senior public officials in different states who sought to be awarded libel. This made many news organizations censor whatever they wrote to protect themselves from being sued for defamation. The New York Times, in its defense, claimed that the case was used to intimidate journalists from speaking out against injustices and illegal actions done by public employees. This coincided with heightened civil rights activities in the South led by Martin Luther King Jr., who advocated for racial equality between blacks and whites. This case was supposed to deal with freedom of speech regarding issues of public importance by the press and other members of the public. The case also sought to establish if the newspaper's actions were driven by malice or a cardinal duty to inform other sections of the public about what was going on in Alabama. The case sought to establish how the First Amendment relates to freedom of expression in the country. It also raised the bar on how defamation cases were resolved. The ruling made by the 9 judges compelled public officials and other parties to show actual malice in newspaper reports before they could be awarded libel. This meant that Sullivan had to show evidence that the newspaper published the information, yet it knew the facts were grossly inaccurate. The ruling made by the 9 judges was a win for press freedom in the country. It made it possible for the press and other people to scrutinize public officials more to ensure they performed their duties diligently. Judge's decision. There were 9 judges involved in the case, and they all ruled in favor of the New York Times. They all agreed that the case against the New York Times lacked merit because the language used to publish it did not attack Sullivan as a person. Justice William Brenner Jr. read the court's unanimous judgment, which used the First Amendment to overturn the decision made by the court in Alabama. Justice Brenner further stated the majority view that it was necessary to protect press freedoms to give the public a chance to scrutinize how public officials were performing their duties. The judges insisted that the press needs to be allowed to perform its role of informing the public without unnecessary restrictions. Therefore, the First Amendment protected news publications from defamation charges even when they were slightly inaccurate. Justices Hugo Black and William Douglas added that the First Amendment gives the press and other members of the public the freedom to debate the conduct of public officials. They added that this is the only way freedom of expression in the country could be guaranteed. They argued that senior public officials need to exercise caution before suing publishing companies in a bid to get libel settlements from claims of defamation. Justices Harlan, White, Douglas, Goldberg, Warren, and Clark agreed with the majority opinion of the court. The court upheld that the newspaper did not publish false statements in the advert that misrepresented actual events in Alabama. They all agreed that the court in Alabama erred in awarding Sullivan $500,000 for libel because the case lacked merit. Conclusion. The ruling opened up the freedom of the press in the country and allowed journalists to perform their duties with fewer restrictions. It made it difficult for public officials to file libel cases against newspapers because they had to prove actual malice before any defamation case was ruled in their favor. Press freedoms were now protected under the First Amendment, and future cases had to refer to this ruling before any decision was made. The case had a positive effect on civil liberties in the country because it allowed U.S. citizens to debate various public issues affecting them freely. This allowed Americans to demand better governance because more people were able to probe public officials and agencies. The court had observed that the advert in the newspaper was a form of public protest against incompetent public officials. It expressed the failure of some state agencies to perform their duties as they were required to as stipulated by the law. However, the ruling had some disadvantages because it emboldened some news companies to misrepresent facts to achieve their agendas. Some media establishments have since resorted to sensationalism, which has made them publish various types of content that are not backed up by facts. Some of those who are falsely mentioned by the press find it difficult to prove they have been defamed by newspaper publications. This has given rise to more irresponsibility because some media organizations infringe on the rights of others as they seek to increase their sales. However, the ruling made it possible for the public to vet all people chosen to perform public functions to determine their suitability.